chapter 3 is really about, two things are going to happen. He's going to talk about, in this continuing theme of how Jesus is better. He's better than Moses, and we'll explain why Moses. And then he's saying that if he's so much superior, we have to be very, very careful to pay close attention to what great gifts we've been given, because there's a real threat of people falling away by the hardness of their heart. So that's all in chapter 3. And so again, Jesus is better. We looked at this idea that who is man, and now we're going to just look at this thought where he says, okay, Jesus then is better even than Moses. Now, would anyone at just first impulse, why would he start comparing Jesus to Moses?
Moses was a lawgiver.
When Miriam and Aaron went to bad mouth Moses, and God said, in all the earth, there's nobody as humble as him.
All right, he's called the meekest man in the world. That's right. Exactly. He was what?
He was the lawgiver.
He was the lawgiver. What else?
He was the leader when the Jews became the Jews.
He delivered Israel out of captivity up to Mount Sinai. And it says, who else spoke to God face to face? Now, he wasn't literally face to face, but it's a language. No one else spoke to God like God spoke to Moses. And he got to behold his glory. It was so much that his face just shined. The rabbis and the Jewish people of Jesus' day, they held no one in higher esteem than Moses. Because, well, he's the one that started all, their great deliverer. But in many ways, we know he's just a shadow of the real deliverer, which is going to be Jesus. Even Moses said that in Deuteronomy, where he says, God will raise up a prophet like unto myself. In other words, a redeemer, a deliverer, a lawgiver. And he says that anyone that doesn't heed him to everything he says will be utterly destroyed. Now that's a quote from Acts chapter 3, where Peter quotes that section. All right, Clinton, you had Hannah?
Moses and Elijah met Jesus just before he was going to die.
Well, exactly. So, he shows he's an icon of the law and the prophets. And so the reason the Hebrew writer is going to compare Jesus to Moses, because you couldn't have someone any higher esteemed than Moses by the Jews. Talking about Jewish Christians specifically. And so he's not trying to minimize and put down Moses, but he's acknowledging Moses was a great man. Now, if you do that as your benchmark, then you show that Jesus is even superior or greater. Well, then how much great must Jesus be? See, that's going to be the reason for his argument. And so it's like me taking your favorite sports person or actor or singer or whatever, preacher, and say, well, I got someone that's a zillion times better. All right? Well, that's what's going on here. So he begins in chapter 3 in verse 1, and we're going to see some instructions or encouragements. He says, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our conviction. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. So he's acknowledging Moses was a faithful servant. But he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, speaking of Jesus, by so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. So what is he suggesting that Jesus is? The creator and the builder of the house. Now when we think or see the word house, it's speaking of really not a building, but a family, a household. And so when you think of the house, you're thinking of the people of God. And so was he part of God's chosen nation, a people for his own possession?
Yes.
But what he's going to say, Jesus is worthy of more glory because he wasn't just in the family, he was what? The builder of the family. That makes him superior, doesn't it? Now in the New Testament, Israel of the Old Testament was the Jewish nation, who would be God's house today? What would we think of? The church. And you want to think of 1 Timothy chapter 3, where Paul says in verse 15, I'm writing these things so one might know how he ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of the truth. Now, household of God means someone's what? Their family, all right? And he says, we are, or the household of God is the church of God. The church of God is the family of God. So when you think of house, don't think building. We always think of people, and in this case, specific people that are in a relationship to God. So he says, every house, verse 4, is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Well, if Jesus is superior than Moses, and the builder of everything is God, he's really calling Jesus God again here. So verse 5, now Moses was faithful in his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son, not in the house, but a son what? Over the house. So not only is he the builder, but he is what? Lord of this house. And so who we are, now he's talking about us Christians, and he says that's who we are, part of Christ's house, God's house. Then there's this word if, and he's introducing and now transitioning to the exhortation phase that'll go through the rest of the chapter. If we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope until the end. And I'd like to get to that at the end of the class and spend a fair amount of time just on that last half of verse 6. Holding fast our confidence and the boast of our hope until the end. But now he's going to explain, though, why this is important, verse 7 through 11. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me, and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation, and said, they also always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. And I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, there is an illustration of what? What account is he drawing into a picture here? You got to remember this and know this.
This was Kadesh and Barnea when they
Okay.
rejected with the spies. And,
Okay, exactly right. So we'll take a peek in a little bit. In Numbers 13 and 14, Moses had led them all the way up to the promised land, and they sent 12 spies, one for each tribe, and they were gone how long?
40 days.
40 days, right? And they come back with this glowing report about what a beautiful land God has got in store for us. But the problem is, they're fortified cities, walled cities, and the guys are giants, and these guys are a bunch of slaves people, you know, the Israelites, and said, we can't take the land. And there's a big uproar. Now that's going to be the bulk of next week's class, because in verse 12, he says, do not what? He says, take care, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil, unbelieving heart and falling away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it be called today, lest any of you should be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Now that piggybacks the story of what? Israel rebelling in the wilderness, and because of their rebelling, what happened to them?
They all died.
They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and every one of them that were part of the original census, age 20 and over, they died. We call it the lost generation. And they died. They were not allowed to enter the rest, even though they were just at its door. Because of what? Hard heart, unbelief, and they rebelled and provoked God to anger. That's what the text says. So why is that drawn in there? All this strong language, God's wrath and anger. Because the same scenario can exist for us today. Now, here's the question. Moses, greatest prophet, greatest man in the Old Testament, revered by the Jews. And if this is how people suffered when they disobeyed back then. You get it? And here Christ is superior to Moses, worthy of more glory. How much more worthy of punishment are we if we fall short and disobey him? You can't even answer the question. But that's the gist of this warning. Now, someone had their hand up, or David?
Well, I just want to make mention of the fact when Moses was a baby, they were looking to get him killed then.
Yeah.
Same thing as Jesus.
Well, sure, there's lots of parallels, right?
So there's those parallels that are
Right.
very similar in so many ways of Moses and Jesus, but Jesus is so much far better because of the new law in which he brought, and
That's right. So exactly. And so I just want to go back and review just a false doctrine we always have to deal with. And it has to do with how we achieve salvation. And since the Reformation, there's been this ongoing debate between God's election and free will, and it still goes on today, and we could spend hours talking about it. But there was a guy named Jacobus Armenia. He was a Dutch reformer, and he is the one that held to what we call, he espoused the importance of free will of each individual. And then, of course, out of Augustine, who led through Calvin, and then Luther, and that they developed the doctrine of we know as Calvinism, right? And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it's important because the theme throughout Hebrews is watch out, stay on the alert, do something, and it's in conflict with really a lot of major doctrinal positions that denominations hold today. But basically, when it comes to salvation, when you talk about free will and embracing each of us have the opportunity, salvation is really a matter of whosoever will believe, right? Now, where do we get that from when we're talking about salvation? Where do we get a verse that says that? John 3:16. God so loved the world that whosoever believes should not perish but have eternal life. Now, does that sound open-ended? It sounds, you couldn't make it more open-ended. And is it conditional? Whosoever. But see, Calvinism, there's a lot of reasons. I can't even go into all what led them down this path. And they will cherry pick certain scriptures to try to support it. But they're going to say, no. It's not a whosoever will. Because we're all born so terribly born in sin, and we're totally depraved. There's no possibility of anybody doing anything good, because even when it looks good, they're doing it for an evil motive. And so it's impossible for an unregenerate man to even have a heart that turns to God, that wants to serve God. So it's impossible for man to even have faith in God. That's extreme hyper-Calvinism, what they call it. And so God had to pick those who were going to be saved, and then by his grace, work on them and give them faith so they would turn to him. Because anything they did that were incapable first, and if they had to do something, then it's salvation by works and not by faith. See, this is all a pushback against the Catholics. And they pushed them way too far the other way. So basically, they would make this verse, God so loved the chosen that he gave his only begotten Son, that how would I say that? God so loved the chosen before the foundation of the world, that he gave them his only begotten Son, that the chosen, when they believe or are given faith, they'll be saved. Does that make sense? It's totally opposite, and it's all about those who chose before the foundation of the world that they're going to be saved, and then and by default, God also chooses those who are going to be lost, right? Now, the only thing I give them credit for is they want to acknowledge the sovereignty of God, and then when God determines something, can it ever be thwarted? No. Because God is God. And so they think since God has chosen certain people to be saved and written their name down, that it's impossible then for them ever to be lost. Would that make sense? You would think so. If God is in charge of saving them and they can't do anything to save themselves, when he chooses to save them, and it's by his sovereign will, and they have nothing to do with it, in fact, they call it irresistible grace. You cannot resist his grace when he works on you. He's going to save you whether you like it or not. Now, this is the majority of a lot of denominations believe this. Not maybe the members in the pews don't get it, but it's what's being taught. And I get so exasperated because when I study and prepare for this, most of the commentaries, most of the so-called scholars, they all push this type of thinking into Hebrews. And I'm going somewhere, so just stay with me. That's why we have to talk about it, you be aware of it. And so, but if God's going to do the saving, and it's all about his will, you're going to be saved no matter what you do. Because it's impossible to be lost because God's doing the saving. So it's called perseverance of the saints, all right? Because you're chosen. Now, we're going to find in Hebrews, he says what? Let us fear. Watch out. Pay close attention, lest you drift. Now we're going to get in chapter 5 when he's going to talk, well, in chapter 3 he says, encourage one another day after day, lest any of you, what? Verse 12, fall away from the living God. Does that sound like you can fall away when it says that? Well, it sounds like that because that's what it says. And then in chapter 6 he says, for those who have tasted the good word of God and been come to God and then fall away, it's impossible to renew them to repentance. And of course, we mentioned chapter 10 already in verse 26. In the case of those who have been enlightened and then continue to sin willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain expectation of judgment. And so we see all these warnings in the book of Hebrews, excuse me. Why did I say that? All right, warnings. But when you come to Calvinism, they're going to say, well, they're going to have to deal with all those warnings, right? And there's two camps when it comes to it. One says there is a matter of persevering. See, you know why I scribble so you can't check my spelling? Right? Whosoever will perseverance, right? Because they want to acknowledge all the instruction and encouragement to persevere. And then the other camp says, it doesn't matter. When you embrace faith, well, God gives it to you in the first place. Once you have faith, now you have salvation, and grace is going to keep coming to you no matter what you do the rest of your life. You could go back to sin or whatever. It just doesn't matter. And so that's kind of a backlash to it because a lot of people think they're Christians just living in the world. And so a lot of them are saying, no, you need to now put off the old man and put on the new one. And they're trying to make some sense of these warnings, like encourage one another. And it does matter how you live. But you know how they do that, though, and still believe in once saved, always saved? And here's what's so sad. Just look at verse 12 real quick. And I don't want to steal your thunder for next week. But notice where he says, chapter 3, verse 12, take care lest there should be in of you an evil, unbelieving heart and falling away from the living God. They're saying, if you were a Christian and everyone held you as a child of God and you were one of the chosen, but you end up falling away, because they acknowledge it happens, right? They see it in their own ranks, and the Bible talks about it. You know what their explanation for that is? You were never really had a true faith to start with. You were never born again. You were not one of the chosen. And you say, well, how do you know that? Because it's impossible for the chosen to lose their salvation in this circular reasoning. And since we thought you were saved, but obviously you weren't, because if you really were saved, you would have persevered. Now, wait a second. That's real convenient. That way, that everyone that falls away, it wasn't their fault. It's just because they were not chosen in the first place. Really, it's God's fault, because he actually never wrote their name down. And so really, then, what do these things mean? They said, well, if you really have a heart of faith, and you've really been a true faith, not a false faith, a genuine faith, these scriptures are going to prick you, and you're going to want to always persevere, and you're always going to want to do the things necessary to not fall away. All right, that's convenient too, but it still flies in the face of your whole argument that if God does the operation on you, is it possible for you ever to fall away? No. That's their argument. No. So why do I even need to teach these? You understand what I'm saying? If it's impossible for you to fall away if you have a genuine faith, let's just go our merry way, and the ones that are true Christians will make it, and those that don't. Now the problem is, with this, it creates this huge doubt. I got to write that in red letters. I don't have red. Well, blue, because you're sad. It creates this doubt. You know what kind of doubt I'm talking about? I don't know if I'm saved. I don't know if I'm one of the chosen. Because I wrestle with sin. I wrestle with doubt in my heart. I have sometimes little faith, sometimes big faith. Sometimes I commit the same sin that I've been trying to battle. And you're telling me that if a person does that, they must have a false faith and not be one of the chosen anyway. But I really believe I'm one of the chosen, because everyone's telling me the chosen, but I still battle these things. And that doesn't seem to be congruent with the whole doctrine you're teaching. It's impossible to be lost, because I feel lost. So it creates this whole uncertainty about whether you're even saved. They don't know who's on the list. We just have to wait till the end and find out who's still standing. That's basically how it goes. Hebrews says, we got such a great salvation. Jesus is doing the saving. You just have to hang on. Because look at verse 6 again. And that's where we're going to come back to. What's the promise? Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 6. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are. Is there any doubt we're part of his family? No. You know you are, because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son for you. That if you choose to believe, you could be part of this household. So then he says, what do you need to do? Just hold fast. What does that mean? Hang on. Just don't quit. And you'll make it. So how come people lose their salvation? There's only one reason. Does Satan pluck them out of God's hand? No. Why? They quit. Now you go, why would they quit? Hebrews is telling all different reasons why people quit. The first reason is chapter 2 is because of neglect. They get sidetracked. They get more involved in other things that aren't important. And so they drift. See, drifting isn't intentional. It's by accident. But it's actually because of neglecting of keeping their eyes on Jesus, right? You understand what I'm saying? There's no way you can lose your salvation if you just don't quit. Hang on and hold fast the confession of your hope. Now, and it starts in verse 1. What does he say? Brethren, let us what? What does it say? There's the instruction. What is it? Verse 1. There's an instruction there. Consider Jesus. Consider Jesus. Now, when ships come into harbor, he's looking and he's got his focus. That's where I'm going. So he's going into the harbor. If they're running ashore on the ground like a boat, they got their eyes fixed. He says, let's think about Jesus. And it's more than just thinking about him. It's comprehending him, trying to understand him and who he is and what he's done and how important we are to him and what a great salvation we have. He says, think about it. You got to do some work to keep your faith what? Alive and vibrant and active. Think about Jesus. Now, a lot of people just don't think about Jesus. They might think about him a little bit on Sunday when we eat the Lord's Supper, or maybe when we sing a song, or when we come to a class like this. But the majority of the world are not here, are they? Most people don't ever really think about Jesus. And we wonder why they drift. They drift. Now, the last thing I want to think about are things that get in my way. So, if my wife says, hey, you need to lose a few pounds, and says, you probably ought to not have that cake tonight. So I want to hear that? No, I don't want to think about that when I want to eat the cake. And I don't want to hear anything about ice cream when I want to have ice cream. See, the last thing you want to think about are the things you're supposed to do when you want to do something else. There's another reason. That has to do with an evil heart. But Jesus says, the Hebrew writer says, consider or think about Jesus. Now in chapter 12, he's going to come back to that. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. All right. Well, why Jesus? He's so much greater than Moses.
So I was just going to mention what Paul said about Demetrius and those that were in the faith that fell away.
Yeah, they were shipwrecked.
They were shipwrecked. They went back into the world. And he talked about it. So they were once counted among the faithful, but they chose.
All right, there's many examples, but they would say no, they didn't have a genuine faith, or else they never would have been shipwrecked. Again, it's this circular reasoning, because if they really had a genuine faith, they never would have abandoned.
But that wasn't Paul's whole address.
No.
He addressed it. He addressed it from the issue of faith. And said they were numbered with us.
No, it's really difficult, like you're saying, just to deal with that. You know, you can't. You can't even deal with these verses because in them there are these imperatives. He says, let us encourage one another. That's an imperative command. Well, now I'm doing something. I thought Jesus does all the saving, but now he's commanded me to do something. Well, there's a conflict. Well, we understand it because we understand I have to marry my will to Jesus Christ. You understand? That he says, I'll do the saving, but you got to hang on. You got to trust me. You got to believe in me. I'll do the saving, but you got to come to me. So, the best example I can give is I've never bought a lottery ticket in my life, so I'm not encouraging you to buy a lottery ticket. And I have to say that because I'm going to use the lottery ticket as an example. So someone gives me a lottery ticket as for a birthday present. And I cash it. I go down, check it, and it says, you won $100 million, Powerball. Now, I probably check it like 15 times, right? Then ask someone else to check it. Did I see that right? And then I'd have to make sure the person didn't want half of it that gave it to me, because they probably sued. But I'm an instant millionaire, right? But am I a millionaire yet? What do I got to do? I got to take that ticket and go take it to the authorities, the proper one, and verify it's real and I'm the possessor of it, and then I'll get the money. So how tightly will I be holding fast to that ticket? In the next month, because I'm going to talk to a financial accountant. Chuck, I need an appointment with you. My CPA. I'm going to talk to some lawyers. I'm going to talk to a lot of people to get everything done before I go down there and decide whether I'm going to take it cash or payments, right? But in that month, how tightly am I going to guard that ticket? And will I ever let it out of my sight? I'll probably put it in a safe and carry the safe with me. I don't know. Why? Because it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But actually, it's just a piece of paper, and the face value is what? Worth less than a penny. But when you turn it in, what do you got? Riches. Did I earn any of it? No. It was a gift. That's faith. It's faith. God says, I'll do the saving. You just got to believe. And so the Hebrew writer says, hang on to that faith. Hang on. Now, I preached more or less, and can we look at the text now? We can do it in 15 minutes. All right? But I hope you get where we're going with this. So he says, therefore, my holy brethren, We're brethren with Jesus. We're holy. Why? Because of what God has done for us. I mean, this language is so ripe and rich. He says, you're partakers of heavenly calling. See, Moses was called to deliver Israel. He led them out of Egyptian slavery. They crossed the Red Sea and baptized in the Red Sea, and they were saved from their enemies, but they're called just to an earthly kingdom, weren't they? With cities and real vineyards and animals and dust and all that. But we're got a heavenly calling. God sent His Son and He called us because He's our the apostle. One apostle means someone sent forth, and Jesus is the high apostle, sent forth by God to call us where? Not to an earthly kingdom, not to an earthly home, but to a heavenly home with a heavenly Jerusalem. That'll be chapter 12, on a heavenly city, and we're going to be part of God's temple. It's so much better what we're being called to. And he says, just think about Jesus. And he says He's the high priest of your confession. See, the confession is where I say publicly, and I pronounce my allegiance to Jesus Christ. See, that's a willful act. And confession becomes your profession. What you confess to be true is how you're going to profess and live in your life. It becomes your very profession. People say, what do you do? Well, I'm a professional this. Well, what we are followers of Christ, and we profess that by our daily walk, every day of our life. He was faithful to Him who appointed him, that's God, just as Moses was. And so he's talking about, first of all, this high priest. That's where I want to go back to chapter 2 and verse 17. Remember it says he had to be made like his brethren? We studied that last week. That he might become a merciful high priest. So we already read that. He had to become flesh and blood for what reason? So he could what? Die. Very good. Why did he have to die? Okay, you're right. So he could go into the grave and render powerless. This is in verse, 13? Him who had the power of death. Who's that? And then deliver those, he says, who were held captive by him all these years. That would be Abraham, it'd be Moses, it'd be Rahab. It'd be all those people that died before the cross, right? And Jesus died to go get them. The cross was the portal to get in Hades and Rome. And so when he came out, he became a high priest because he offered something. What did he offer? Himself. And that's going to be chapter 7, 8, 9 when he talks about the high priesthood of Jesus. But he did it to make propitiation. Now, that's a word we don't use much, but I need to have us talk about this idea of propitiation. And it's an interesting word. It means, really, in their day, the heathens or the godless people that believed in idolaters, gods, they would always offer animal sacrifices to appease the gods, because the gods were always constantly angry. That's why you had tornadoes in the Midwest. They would think that was the god of the wind, right? You had a drought, that was the god of the sun or the god of the rain. You know, they're all mad at us constantly, so we have to always sacrifice things to make them not as bad, all right? Well, he's using that word because the word propitiate sometimes refers to the sacrifice offered, but it's the idea of to appease or satisfy. That's a better word. Satisfy. Because when there is a crime done, does justice demand that a payment be made?
Yes.
Do you understand? And when there's a crime done, whether it's a robbery or someone just burns someone's house down or something on purpose, justice cries for satisfaction. And so the judge can't say, well, I know you had a bad day, I would have burnt the house down too, go your way. And you go, wait a second, I want to be appeased here or satisfied. Someone needs to propitiate for this thing. You can't just excuse them because I'm at the one that's been, hurt here. I'm the one that's financially at a loss. Well, that's what it is with sin. The wages of sin are death. In other words, there's two ways to look at that. You're owed death because actually you did the crime, but sometimes we say if you do the crime, you got to do the time. If you play, you got to pay. And that's kind of what it is, that if you're going to play in sin, you're going to have to pay the price. And justice demands that. It's fair, and it actually shows a loving God. A loving God will avenge those who've been wrong, and he'll make sure justice always prevails. And to have justice, you have to have propitiation. Well, Jesus made propitiation for your sins. How did he do it? He said, you played, I'll do the paying. Because he offered what? Himself. Now that'll be in the rest of the book of Hebrews as well. And so that's how he become our high priest. So I'm going to go through just a bunch of quick notes because I just want you to see this, all right? He took on flesh and blood to render powerless whom had the power of death, that is devil. So he might deliver those who the fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That was you and me before Christ died on the cross, even if we didn't know about it. He lived in the flesh without sin. Now, that's going to be in chapter 4. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but who is one who's been tempted in all things, just like we, but yet what? Pure. Does he understand what it's like to walk on this earth? The word tempted can mean most often tested. Was he tested to quit?
Yes.
Oh yeah, what was he in the garden asking? 3 times in his prayers.
Let this come.
Lord, let it pass. Is that a temptation to quit?
Yes.
You say, well, I don't think I like quitting, but he's asking to be excused. He knows what it's like to keep on going on and doing with the Lord. It's hard. A lot harder than we've ever been through. He says he understands. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he committed no sin, where there was any deceit found in his mouth. Let's go on, a couple more. But he became sin for us. That's how he propitiated, appeased God, or satisfied the debt we played, he paid. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the very righteousness of God. That's how thorough this propitiation is. When the payment is made, you are as righteous as Jesus Christ. And I know we have a hard time seeing that, but that's exactly what it's talking about. In Hebrews chapter 9, when you get there, inasmuch it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment. What's the second death? That's eternal death in the lake of fire. You're all going to die once unless Jesus comes. You don't have to die twice. So Christ also, he died once that he might what? Bear the sins of... He bore your sins. That's why he died, so you don't have to. It's been satisfied. You're free from all that guilt and all that sin and all that judgment. So he tasted death literally for everyone. We do not see him who's been made a little lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering and death, crowned with glory and honor. By the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Does that mean you? I'm sorry, this is blasphemous. God chose just a few for Christ to die for. Jesus tasted death for who? Everyone. Now, will everyone be saved? No, because not everyone will come to him, because it's a whosoever will proposition. Who does the saving? He does. I have to come to him. All right? And so then we go on and just looking at just this whole theme throughout the Bible, especially we're staying in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12, that he, having offered one sacrifice for sins, one. Now, you don't understand, I wrestle with this when I say you. It's hard to understand how one sacrifice could cover everyone's sin. I can see one for one, right? That seems fair. That he could die for Donna, but then it's all used up. It takes someone else to die for Dave or Esther. But he said he died once for who? How can that be? There's only one answer. Huh? Because of his position. He's not Moses. He's not just a man. He's God in the flesh. He's so much superior. When God dies for the creation, there's enough power in his blood to save what? It satisfies every sin for everyone that comes to him. And so we have to trust him so explicitly and completely that I am totally forgiven. I've got riches waiting for me, and I'm going to hang on to this ticket, my faith, and I'm not going to let go. Because I have a great high priest. Yes?
The only way I can rationalize that is that he is the creator of everyone, and therefore he can be the redeemer of everyone.
Exactly. Exactly. So verse 18 ends, he was tempted in that which he suffered, and he's able to come to the aid. And I finished last week, come to the aid means literally to run to the cry. So he's merciful because he's willing to die for us. He was willing. He didn't have to, he chose to. He was willing because he loves us. But also, he continues to be a faithful high priest. When he hears us cry, this word come to the aid literally means run to the cry. So when a little baby cries, and you know a cry of anger, a cry of just being stubborn, and we know our kids when they cry from hurt. Don't you know the difference? And when you hear a cry for hurt, what do you always do? Run. That's Jesus. Now, I don't know if you see that in your mind's eye, and maybe we don't because we don't cry to him enough. But if we cried to him, because when we're being tempted and we want to quit and it's hard, what will he do? He will run to our aid and do things to make sure that we can walk faithfully. How does he do that? I don't know. Let him be God and all this falter. Because I don't know how he does all this. So, there is why he's worthy of more glory. More than Moses. More than anyone that's ever been on there. Because he's a builder of the house. And so, yeah, Moses was faithful, but he was a servant. But Jesus is faithful as a son. He's Lord over the house. He built the house. So that's why he says, do not harden your hearts. Now, if it's impossible to lose your salvation, why this exhortation? It makes no sense, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. We can just skip this part because if your name's on the list, you're going. And if it's not, I don't care what I say, you can't get on the list. Sorry. Right? Does that make sense? I'm talking about this side. But if we understand it's a whosoever will, God wants us to follow him, then this exhortation makes all the sense in the world. He says, you've got this ticket in your hand. It's riches. You just got to hang on till when? The end. Now where's the end?
No.
Either when he comes or you leave. Right? I don't know when your end's going to be. But don't be like them in the wilderness. Now notice a couple things. They provoked God. They tested God. In other words, he gave them adequate evidence and they weren't willing to listen. They weren't willing to trust. So they fell in the wilderness. And God said, how long? Numbers 14 and verse 11. Will these people spurn me? See, that's rejection. It's ripping up the ticket. You know, I don't want these millions. How long will they not believe in me? That means trust. Despite all the signs. And he says, surely all the men have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times. I tried to count the 10 tests, but 10 means what? Complete. Thoroughly rejection. And have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land to which I swore them. So if they hardened their hearts and fell in the wilderness, and we've hardened our hearts, will we make it into the promised land? No. There's no way. So, there's where we are, and there's that lost generation. And so, we'll let Dean pick up the solution. The solution is encourage one another. But here, hold fast what? This is the solution right here so far. What? Hold fast. That word confident means the boldness of speech, the freedom of speech. When you know something to be true, you don't care what anyone says, you're going to say it anyway. He says, you just hang on to it. The confidence and the boast of our hope. Hope doesn't mean, I don't know if I'm going to make it. What does hope mean?
Expectation.
Confident expectation. I know I'm going because God's saving me. And I'm going to hang on to my faith. How long am I hang on to it? What does it say? The end. So you know how you get to heaven? Just don't quit. It's just that easy. Don't quit. If you get knocked down, you got to crawl for a week, just crawl. If you can get back up on your feet, because he'll help you, just keep walking. Just don't quit. And we'll see you in heaven. All right.